All right, so we have two goals today. So we're going to talk about some trends in philosophy and art at the turn of the century. And then we're also going to talk about how anti-Semitism intensified at the turn of the century. Now, these things might not seem to be related, but I'm going to make the case that they are. All right, so at the turn of the century, most Europeans continued to value reason and science and progress, right? All those Enlightenment or positivist ideas that we saw being really popular at the end of the 18th century and in the beginning of the 19th century as well. However, for some European artists and intellectuals, cracks in their faith in reason and truth began to grow. And I'll argue this is a result of kind of two things. There were some discoveries in science that challenged Enlightenment ideas about physics. And there's also going to be some political developments that are going to challenge Enlightenment political ideas, especially about equality and the brotherhood of mankind. So art and philosophy is going to become increasingly pessimistic and dark and fascinated with the irrational, the strange, and the unconscious. So we're going to look at a bunch of different movements today, but they're all part of this broader move away from realism and reason and this faith in objective truth, and it's called modernism. And it's actually going to continue and actually intensify after World War I. So we'll look at that a little bit as well, a little bit later. So we've got a four-step plan for today. So first, we're going to discuss the changes in science that challenged European faith and reason. We're going to discuss two thinkers, Nietzsche and Freud, who believed that human beings were motivated by unconscious instinct rather than reason. So again, challenging some Enlightenment ideas there. We're going to discuss some of the new artistic and literary movements that emerge in response to these changes. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the rise of mass politics. And we're going to talk about how this challenged Enlightenment political ideals of equality. And then we're going to look specifically at anti-Semitism, which was, I will argue, a consequence of this rise of mass politics. All right. So by the way, big grab bag today. Get out your flashcards, lots of names, lots of things to remember. All right. So let's talk first about some new discoveries in science. So scientists increasingly began to question Newtonian physics. So again, questioning the scientific revolution, questioning the Enlightenment. And what did they question? The idea that atoms are the building blocks of all matter. They started to wonder, could there be something smaller? So Marie Curie and her husband Pierre discovered that the element radium emits particles as it undergoes radioactive decay, which to them proved that maybe the atom's not the building block of all matter. Maybe there's something smaller. If you're interested in this, I am. It's super fascinating. There's a lot more to be said here. There's a really good book called Strange Glow by Timothy J. Jorgensen. And the whole first part of the book is devoted to not only how radiation was discovered, but sort of what effects it had practically and on Europeans' perception of the world. Super interesting. Following from that, another really important discovery is the theory of relativity, which, as you probably know, you folks are taking physics, was discovered by Albert Einstein. And I am going to repeat the definition in the textbook here, which is, so the theory of relativity proposes that time and space are not absolute, but relative to the observer. I didn't take physics in high school. It was not required. So I'll admit my understanding of this is very limited. So if you have questions, ask your physics teacher. But again, what's important for our course is that it's challenging these earlier ideas that were discovered during the scientific revolution. All right, so now let's get into philosophy, which I do know a lot more about, especially this gentleman with a fantastic mustache here. His name is Friedrich Nietzsche, and that is how you pronounce that. Very difficult to spell. So Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher. He was born in this part of Saxony that was absorbed by Prussia before Prussia absorbed all of the German states. And he is really most famous for rejecting Enlightenment faith in reason and Enlightenment faith in objective morality and truth. So he rejected this idea that you can arrive at truth through reason, through study. So unlike Enlightenment philosophers, Nietzsche believed that people weren't actually motivated by reason at all, but by unconscious drives. And he thought there were a bunch of different unconscious drives, but sort of the main drive that he believed motivated all human behavior was this thing called the will to power, which is a desire to dominate and control. But it's also a desire to create new things. Now, Nietzsche being German, right? Did he see something new being created out of this country's desire to dominate and control others? Absolutely. Is that maybe where that idea came from? Who knows? So, and we'll talk about Nietzsche nationalism later on. He's weird. So Nietzsche believed that So Nietzsche rejected the Enlightenment, but he also rejected Christianity. So he believed that Christianity and its emphasis, misspelled there, on kindness and charity had caused people to repress this natural will to power, right? You can't go around dominating others if you believe that you have an obligation to be kind to others, right? Well, Nietzsche did not like this at all. He thought this had two really big bad consequences. So the first one was psychological distress. You're living against your natural instinct. That's not good, right? But he also believed that this led to cultural malaise, right? He's like, if people lived according to their will to power, they could create great art, they could create great empires. He's very into the Greeks and Romans. He thought they embraced their will to power, sort of. So it's like, if people can't authentically embrace their will to power because they're too focused on like charity and self-abnegation because they're Christians, then society will not be as powerful as it could be. All right. But interestingly enough, Nietzsche believed that sort of the Enlightenment and Christianity were in conflict, right? He believed that as Enlightenment secularism took hold, like a genuine faith in Christianity and Christian values wasn't really possible anymore. So he said, well, there's all these people, they claim to be Christian, they're going to church on Sundays, but they don't really believe in those values anymore in the same way that they used to. So Nietzsche did see a potential negative in this, actually. He worried that people would move away from Christian values, but they wouldn't really replace them with anything. And in his mind, this would lead to kind of apathy and despair. So we're just kind of like, we say we're Christian or we say we believe in kindness, but we don't really. So we're just kind of sitting around. We don't really believe in anything. We just sit on our couch watching TV and eating bonbons all day. But on the other hand, Nietzsche also believed that this opened up some new positive opportunities. He's like, well, if Christianity isn't a thing anymore and people don't really believe in Christian values, well, that means that we can actually live according to our will to power again. But he had some caveats about this. He didn't think we should just like run around, oppressing everyone. He's like, okay, well, we want to live authentically according to our will to power. But we want to do this in a healthy way. Well, what did that look like for Nietzsche? Remember, part of the will to power is this will to creation. So he's like, why don't we use our will to power? Let's go out. Let's compose symphonies. Let's create great art. And believe me, he did try. His music. It's not great. Now, Nietzsche called this hypothetical person who could have the courage to throw off all those dead old Christian values and live authentically and embrace their will to power and create great art. He called that person the Übermensch or the Superman. He didn't really have any specific examples, which is not helpful. I like Nietzsche, but I also really like dunking on Nietzsche. So Nietzsche is also really famous for challenging the Enlightenment ideals of objective morality. So a lot of Enlightenment philosophers believe that you could use reason to discern what was good, what was true. But Nietzsche's like, you know what? The definition of goodness has changed over time. So what the ancient Greeks thought was good is different from what we think is good now. So what that signaled to him was that there's really no such thing as objective good. What's good for you isn't necessarily good for me. It's not necessarily good across time periods or across countries. So what does that mean, right? And in some of his writings, Nietzsche actually went a step further. He's like, not only is there no such thing as objective good that we can discover through reason, he's like, there's no such thing as objective truth at all. There's nothing that we can understand through reason. So there's this really famous quote from him: there is no truth, there is only interpretation. There's a lot of different translations of that, but that's from this essay called On Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense from 1873. But Nietzsche did also kind of walk this back in some of his later writings. He was known for kind of contradicting himself all over the place. So did he really challenge objective truth? A little bit, kind of here, somewhere, there, not all over the place. All right. So Nietzsche was not the only person to argue that people are motivated by instinct and unconscious drives. So the other person who challenged this idea was not actually a philosopher. He read Nietzsche, although he claimed not to have read Nietzsche. He was actually a psychologist, and a doctor. So his name was Sigmund Freud, and he applied this philosophy of the irrational to his practice, and he developed this thing called psychoanalysis, which is kind of a forerunner or a form of psychology. There are some psychologists today who still practice psychoanalysis, but they're kind of few and far between. Freud has been replaced by evidence-based psychology. So like Nietzsche, Freud argued that our behavior is driven by subconscious instinct, and that the repression of this instinct can be really unhealthy, mostly on an individual level, but maybe also on a societal level as well. However, right, Nietzsche is all about this will to power, this will to dominate and control. Freud was like, nah, we don't want to fight all the time. We want to enjoy ourselves. So he argued that people are motivated by this drive towards pleasure, which is called the pleasure principle. Nice, easy name to remember. So Freud had this whole idea that sort of like all of our thoughts and actions are the result of this constant battle between our conscious and our unconscious mind and societal expectations, and that to be healthy, we kind of needed to navigate between all of these things and balance them. Freud was also really interested in dreams, which is going to become a little bit relevant later on. All right, so why is that relevant? Authors and artists were also really interested in psychology and dreams and unconscious motivations during this time. And what's interesting is this thing is all kind of in the air. Like these people were reading each other, but like some people arrive at ideas before other people, and there's some interesting overlaps and weird kind of alignments, even from people who hadn't read each other. So it's all just kind of in the air at this time. So the first literary movement that we're going to need to remember is Russian realism. So I mentioned, right, Europeans are moving away from realism. It still kind of holds on in Russia. So Russian authors were still pretty interested in depicting kind of everyday people and their lives and their struggles. But there's kind of a twist to it here. So their work was a lot more dark, a lot more pessimistic usually. And there was a real emphasis on kind of, again, what we're seeing floating around elsewhere, which is that emphasis on psychology and unconscious drives. So the two names we have to remember here are Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky is really interesting because he kind of predicted Nietzsche a little bit. Nietzsche read him and was really inspired. So like Dostoevsky wrote this book called Crime and Punishment, which is all about like this Ubermensch type character named Raskolnikov, who decides that he is above morality. Morality does not exist. It is not, there's no such thing as objective good. And he decides to, as a result of that, commit a murder. And it's all about sort of the fallout from that. It's a great book, by the way. So that's Russian realism. In the West, realism also kind of evolves in a similar direction. So it evolves into this movement called naturalism, which again, kind of pessimistic, kind of dark, and it really emphasized psychology and unconscious drives. So the author we have to remember here is French. His name is Émile Zola, so put that on your flashcard. And lastly, the last movement is called symbolism. And this movement is not about depicting reality at all. It's about sort of expressing our impressions, our feelings of reality, expressing it through symbols. It's very kind of abstract. Most symbolists were poets. They did not write novels at all, unlike naturalists and Russian realists. And then symbolist poetry is often really dreamlike and dark and strange. So my favorite symbolist poet is Baudelaire. We actually already read him when we talked. He was really interested in talking about sort of what happened to Paris as a result of the Industrial Revolution and Haussmannization. So we read The Eyes of the Poor, which he wrote. But a lot of his poems are just about like weird dreams he had, weird drug trips he had. It's very dark. It's very strange, very focused on like our unconscious experience of the world. Right, so visual arts are also moving away from sort of depicting reality as it is. So the two movements we need to remember here are Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. So there's actually kind of an additional reason here why they're shifting away from realism. Well, now we have photography, right? So if you want to depict the world exactly as it is, well, you take a photo of it, right? You don't need to paint it. So what are artists going to do, right? Well, they're going to sort of depict the world in a different way. So the Impressionists, again, kind of like the symbolist poets, a lot of French people here as well, sought to kind of depict the landscape as they felt it, kind of focusing on the light and the color and the form, not as it actually looked. And then the Post-Impressionists went even a step further. They became even more abstract. So there's some examples there that you can put on your flashcards. All right, so we're going to shift away from art and culture for a little bit, and we're going to start to talk about politics. So one thing that we need to do to kind of contextualize, we're talking about politics and we're talking about anti-Semitism. And one thing we need to do to contextualize this is talk about sort of how is politics changing in the late 19th century. So we're seeing this rise in what we call mass politics, right? So we talked a lot about how Britain over time expanded the electorate, so more and more people are able to vote. The same thing starts to happen in continental Europe as well, except for Russia. So Russia's kind of our exception. They're still a really autocratic monarchy, but like Austria-Hungary, Germany, more and more people, in France, more and more people are able to vote and participate in the political process. Well, that's a really good thing, right? We want more people to be able to vote. That's something that we value here in the United States as well, right? But it also has kind of a dark side. So it coincides with the rise of nationalism, as we've talked about, right? So what we see is in order to gain popularity, in order to gain power, we see a lot of politicians appealing to voters by using fear, by using nationalism, by using anti-Semitism. So kind of a dark side here as well. So the rise of anti-Semitism is a really big issue in France and Austria-Hungary and Germany, kind of as a result of this, right? So we see politicians appealing to those really base instincts in order to get and maintain power. Now, Russia's also going to experience a really significant wave of anti-Semitism, but it's going to be for different reasons, again, because they don't really have this mass politics. So we're actually going to start with Russia, because what happens in Russia is going to influence what happens in Western Europe. All right, so anti-Semitism in Russia. There's kind of two different causes here. So there's a religious causes, plural, and political causes as well. So in terms of religion, a lot of religious, it's actually this goes back to the Middle Ages. So there was this belief in the Middle Ages that, okay, it's gonna sound really wild. So there was this rumor in the Middle Ages called blood libel that alleged that Jewish people practice ritual human sacrifice. Obviously, this is false, right? But it was propagated by religious authorities. So like you go to church, you hear your priest make a sermon about this. So there's kind of sort of an old medieval religious element to anti-Semitism in Russia. Not so much in Western Europe. That kind of died away with the Enlightenment, but still holds on over in Russia. But there's also a very modern political element as well. So we talked about last unit, right, how sort of Tsar Alexander II, he, the Tsar liberator, right, he emancipates peasants, but for some people, he doesn't go quite far enough, and he gets assassinated, right? Well, his son, Tsar Alexander III, who succeeded him, rather than blame this on the people who actually did it, he decided to blame Jewish people for it. So he definitely propagated anti-Semitism as well. His son, Tsar Nicholas II, continued this practice, and he is really, or his government rather, he didn't personally do it. His government was most likely responsible for this really famous anti-Semitic book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I say most likely responsible because we don't really know who wrote this book. It's anonymous. We think it was probably the secret police under Tsar Nicholas II, but we're not sure. But the point is that this book alleged that the secret cabal of Jewish leaders controls the world. So again, that's actually kind of more of a modern anti-Semitic stereotype. So we see kind of all these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, either religious or of political origin, spreading in Russia. What are the consequences of this? So one of the really big consequences is that Jewish people faced really significant legal discrimination. So the biggest thing was they weren't allowed to own land, and they were restricted to living in really specific regions of the Russian Empire. And I'll show you on a map in just a second. Well, why is this significant? Well, again, Russia's a mostly agrarian society. If you want to make money, you need to own land. But more so than that, there are also these periodic waves of violence against Jewish people. And these were called pogroms. So they started around like the 1880s. And again, there were several waves of them that continued throughout the early 1900s. And as a result of this, a lot of Jewish people, they just fled. They left Russia. They immigrated to the United States. They immigrated to Palestine in the Middle East. But a lot of them just stayed in Europe. And they went to Germany and Austria-Hungary, which is going to have some influence on anti-Semitism there. So let's talk about that. All right, before we talk about that though, here's some pictures. So here, as I mentioned, as I promised, here's the region of the Russian Empire, so Western Russia. Nowadays it would be like Ukraine, over here Belarus, and then Poland. So Jewish people were restricted to living in these areas, and they were also restricted to living in specific towns or ghettos, and these are called shtetls. And they were really poor. You can see a photo here, not really not an equitable way to live. All right, so now let's talk about anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria-Hungary. So over here, Jewish people face less legal discrimination than they did in Russia. So Jewish people could own land, they didn't have to live in ghettos, they could live where they wanted. But Jewish people still faced really significant societal prejudice and discrimination, and what we call de facto discrimination, which is informal, it's not legalized discrimination. So, for example, Jewish people could get whatever jobs they wanted theoretically, there were no laws against them getting specific jobs, but they still had a lot of trouble getting promotions to the highest levels of their jobs. So a lot of Jewish people entered the legal profession because that was an avenue for sort of social mobility, but they could be lawyers, but a lot of times they couldn't be judges. They just wouldn't get the promotion, right? It'd go to someone who wasn't Jewish. So there's no law against them being judges, but it was just a lot of discrimination. They couldn't get that. And then, of course, there are all kinds of those kind of typical standard expressions of racism that we see today, right? So people getting shoved in the streets and called names and that kind of thing, right? So what were the causes of this? So here it intersects with some of the things that we've already been talking about. So when we talked about new imperialism, right, we talked about how one of the motivations for that was kind of like this new racial pseudoscience, so like social Darwinism and all of that. So whereas prejudice against Jewish people in the Middle Ages and kind of more in Eastern Europe, it was kind of, there was a religious element to it. Like Jewish people were perceived as practicing a different religion. So like if you could convert, you could kind of get out of it a little bit. Not so in Western Europe. Jewish people were perceived by like these quote unquote race scientists, not a thing. They were perceived as not just a different religion, but like a different race or nationality. So that is, people thought that if you were Jewish, like you couldn't be Jewish and Austrian at the same time. You couldn't be Jewish and German at the same time. You couldn't be Jewish and French at the same time. You were Jewish or you were French or you were Austrian, right? Not the same thing. So that's going on. There's also kind of like this anti-immigrant sentiment that plays into it as well. So as we know, right, a lot of Jewish people are fleeing the Russian Empire. They're going to places like Germany and Austria-Hungary, France to a lesser extent. And nationalist politicians kind of seized on this and used it to build support for themselves. So the most famous example of this is the mayor of Vienna named Karl Lueger. If you know German, you say that's pronounced Luger, Miss Sinceri, but he pronounced it Lueger because it means liar. A politician named Liar. That is great. So Karl Lueger, he made sort of Jewish refugees an element of his campaign. He's basically like, get these people out of our country. They're coming to our country. We don't want them here. They're taking up all the welfare programs that should go to Austrians, right? If that sounds familiar, all those immigrants stealing our welfare. Yeah, people use that rhetoric today. So Karl Lueger didn't invent that. Not the first guy, not the last guy. And then the third reason or third cause of the rise of anti-Semitism in Western Europe is actually the same as it was in Russia. So like we talked about in Russia, there was an association between Jewish people and like radical political movements. Same thing in Western Europe as well. So like a lot of, again, nationalist politicians, they said, oh, all those Marxists, all those anarchists, they're all Jewish. Not true. But they did associate them with that, right? And again, this is all part of that. That's all connected to that idea of the rise of mass politics, right? We see these politicians spreading these rumors, spreading these lies as a way to build support for themselves and gain votes. All right, well, how do Jewish people respond to this? So let's talk about Russia first. So as I mentioned, right, a lot of Jewish people just fled Russia, right? They're like, why stay here? We're getting killed. Of course they would move, right? But others, in kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, actually did join some of those radical movements that people were blaming them for being a part of. So, for example, we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution at the end of this unit. And actually, a lot of the Russian revolutionaries did come from Jewish backgrounds. Most of them were atheists. They rejected religion because that's part of Marxism, but they kind of grew up in Jewish families and experienced anti-Semitism. So that influenced they're joining these things, or joining these kinds of movements. So a really good example of this is Leon Trotsky, who's going to become one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution. And he participated, there's three Russian revolutions. He participated in an earlier sort of attempted revolution called the Revolution of 1905. He was captured, he was put on trial for trying to overthrow the government, and he actually referenced the pogroms as a reason for why he became a revolutionary. So he said, if you tell me that the pogroms, the murders, the burnings, the rapes, if you tell me that Kishinev and Odessa and Bialystok, and these are all places where pogroms occurred, are the form of government of the Russian Empire, then I will agree with the prosecution that we were arming ourselves directly and immediately against the government of the Russian Empire. So he's saying there, he's like, yeah, if that's what government in Russia looks like, it looks like murdering Jewish people, then heck yeah, I'm opposed to the government, right? So that's what he's saying there. Now, in Western Europe, we actually do see some Jewish people joining radical movements as well. They're kind of to a lesser extent. But some Jewish people, and especially refugees from Russia, they actually try to assimilate. They're like, you know what? People are saying that we're different, that we dress differently, we speak different languages, because they did. So like refugees from Russia, they mostly spoke either Russian or Yiddish, which is a language that Russian Jews and some other Eastern European Jewish people spoke. So these people were like, we'll learn how to speak German. We'll learn how to speak French. We'll dress like French people, we're just like German people, right? We'll get good jobs. So like, as I mentioned, right, like law was a really big field that a lot of Jewish people went into. Medicine was as well. So Freud, right, he was Jewish, sort of what his family did. He was a doctor. But other Jewish people were like, you know what? If you don't want us, you don't want us. We'll just leave. And so they developed kind of like this form of Jewish nationalism and wanted to create a state of Israel. over in what was then Palestine. So the most famous example of this is a guy named Theodor Herzl, and he is really the founder of Zionism. So he's like, why don't we all just straight up move to Israel? You don't want us, we will leave. All right, that's the end of that.